Well, greetings to you all from Chipping Norton and to everyone who's there as part of Passion for Life Bridgend. I'm so sorry that COVID has interfered with our lives again, prevented me from being there with you in person this evening. But I'm just grateful that technology means that I don't have to let you down completely. And I hope that you'll all be able to hear me and see me clearly. I did have a few slides to spare you from having to look at me all the way through my talk, but I think it'll be beyond my IT abilities to try and flick between them. So we'll just press on. As you will know already, the thorny issue that I've been asked to talk about this evening is suffering. Something that every single one of us will inevitably face at one time or another. Some more acutely than others, I know. So anticipating that there'll be different situations that different people resonate with. Although we could, of course, simply look at our news headlines depicting mass graves in Ukraine and indiscriminate killing on an unthinkable scale to most of us here in the UK, I thought that instead I'd set the scene with some stories of suffering that I've encountered in recent years among my friends and in my work personally. When my own daughter was born, she was born blind in one eye. Why? When she was nearly a year old, we took her to the first birthday party of one of her little friends, Thomas, whose parents we knew well. And it was such a joyful occasion. But the next morning, his parents found him dead in his cot. No explanation was found. And that moment was so devastating that I still find it hard to talk about it without feeling completely choked up. A few years ago, our friends were expecting their third child when their 20-week scan revealed that she had a rare and severe brain anomaly. They were told that if she survived birth, the chances were that she'd only survive days or weeks. In the end, when she was born, Millie was surprisingly strong. She did have an unusual face, with a soft and squishy nose and a cleft lip, and her eyes were slightly different. And although life was hard for Millie, she went on to live for many months. When she did die, 2 months short of her second birthday, however much of a release it was from her suffering, her family was still heartbroken. Another friend of mine was happily married with 2 gorgeous children until his family were involved in a car crash. His wife was driving when, for some unknown reason, she collided head-on with a 40-ton articulated lorry, and she and her 2-year-old son were killed instantly. How does anyone get through that sort of horror? Before stepping into church leadership, I worked for 10 years as a surgeon, and you can imagine I saw suffering daily. Most of the time as a doctor, you become pretty good at detaching yourself personally from the suffering that you're dealing with. But one of the most heart-wrenching moments that I can still remember vividly was having to operate on a lady who was the same age as my wife at the time and who had children the same age as my children, but who had suffered a horrific complication at the time of childbirth which had left her in a permanent vegetative state. When I'd operated on her, I found myself afterwards just sitting in the changing rooms, sobbing, unable to imagine the unbearable pain that I would be feeling if that had been my wife rather than somebody else's. And again, now, as a vicar, I also have to walk with people through times of suffering. One of the first funerals that I took here in Chipping Norton, here in the Cotswolds, where I lead a church, was for a young lady in her 30s who died suddenly of a drug overdose. Now that on its own would be tragic enough for her family to get through, but it was even worse for the fact that her brother had been killed 9 years earlier in the Boxing Day tsunami in the Indian Ocean. Just a handful of stories which we can't help being moved by, and which illustrates something of the varied ways in which people around us are suffering all the time. And the inevitable question that they raise is why? How can we make sense of the suffering that's always around us? If there is a God of love, why would he let these things happen? So I relate these stories really to acknowledge that suffering is very real and very present. And as I sit here recording this, I'm also very conscious that there'll be some of you there this evening who are feeling very raw, who are either going through or have recently been through something that's caused you to suffer a great deal. Excuse me. And in what I say now, I don't intend to belittle or gloss over anything that you've experienced, and nor do I want you to think that I'm trying to offer any simple one-size-fits-all answer to questions that you might have. Because when it comes to the question of suffering, the truth is there is no simple answer. But at the same time, it does cry out for some way of making sense of it, and there's no skirting around it. So, as we grapple with the question of suffering, what I'd like to consider this evening is which bigger story enables us best to make sense of it all. You might not have realised it before now, but the bigger story in which you've been brought up will have a huge impact on how, or whether even, you're able to make sense of suffering at all. Each and every one of us operates within a bigger narrative, within a wider worldview that informs how we look at everything. And what I want to suggest to you this evening is that the only worldview that I have found to be in any way compelling is the Christian worldview. So let me try to explain why that is. Because when it comes to the ways in which our worldviews affect how we make sense of suffering, it's worth pausing to recognise that while suffering has been a challenge for every successive generation to deal with, it's only a recent development that's taken suffering to be such a prominent barrier to people's faith in God. And the main reason is that we've been heavily influenced by a bigger narrative that says that the material world is all that there is. See, sociologists and psychologists have recognised that the deep human inner compulsion in every culture to help people to face suffering. In their different ways, for example, Hinduism and Buddhism encourage people to move beyond evil and suffering on the journey towards enlightenment. And at the risk of oversimplification, some forms of Hinduism, Advaita Vedanta Hinduism, for example, regard suffering as illusion. And Buddhism similarly regards it as something from which we can detach ourselves through progressive enlightenment. Classical Greek and Roman cultures describe suffering as something that can make a person stronger. And Islam appeals to a person's need to surrender to the inscrutable will of Allah. In the common phrase in the Islamic world, inshallah, which means if God wills, it implies that if you're healthy, it's that God wishes you to be so. So be grateful. If you suffer, God wishes to test you. So the appropriate response to suffering in Islam is simply to accept the will of God. Now, you may or not be impressed by these strategies, to which obviously I've not even begun to do justice in those summaries, but the main point that I want to make is that they and almost every other culture in history and around the world today have an approach to suffering which aims to help people come to terms with it. Now, I'll come back to what Christianity has to offer in a minute, but almost entirely alone as a worldview in this regard stands modern secular materialism, which has no narrative whatsoever in the face of suffering, with the consequence that when suffering is perceived as senseless or a complete waste of time or inescapable, victims tend to develop deep underlying anger or hatred as a result of it. And we see lots of that today with the culture of victimhood that's so prevalent. However it comes to happen, when we buy into that bigger story that tells us that the material world is all that there is, we end up unable to deal with all sorts of issues that previously people had faced very differently. You may remember, but in 2009 there was an atheist advertising campaign which ran the slogan with a slogan on the side of buses saying, "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." But of course the problem is that for most people in a time of suffering, the idea that there might be no God has precisely the opposite effect. It actually causes them to worry because it removes any capacity for dealing definitively with suffering in any positive or dignified way, especially if the immediate physical cause can't be removed. During my work as a surgeon, as a clinical lecturer in Oxford, I set up a small research unit investigating the effectiveness of a novel, non-invasive treatment for cancer. And the people who came to see me were often in an advanced stage of disease and were afraid. And one of the biggest problems that I had was that in my role there, I couldn't, excuse me, I couldn't properly address their greatest concerns. My patients certainly feared physical illness, but their fear was greater because they didn't know what would happen to them if they weren't healed. They didn't know their place in the bigger picture beyond their physical circumstances. And I remember one of the patients the early patients that we treated with this new non-invasive high-intensity focused ultrasound device was a very wealthy and successful man. And his chauffeur used to bring him along in a large and expensive new Range Rover. But however much money or however much success he had, his greatest fear was of dying. And it concerned me that as I tried to help him with his physical suffering, I wasn't even beginning to help him to overcome that fear. I was treating his cancer, but I wasn't helping him with his greater need, which wasn't physical at all. After we treated him, he still suffered the same sense of emptiness inside and had just as strong a fear of dying. So whatever we may have done towards healing him in the short term, we certainly hadn't addressed the deeper seat of his suffering. Apparently, some atheist writers like Richard Dawkins still claim in their proposed worldview, embracing a fully secular perspective of life, they claim that eliminates this whole issue that's caught up with suffering, the so-called problem of evil, and frees people to concentrate on making the world a better place. But before we're too quick just to swallow that assertion whole, we should really question carefully whether it actually works for people. And the strange thing is, as we look into the reality of faith and suffering, we find not only that faith offers extraordinary hope in the face of suffering, but also that however much armchair philosophers like Richard Dawkins from the comfort of leafy North Oxford might waft and muse and pontificate about how suffering can only provide evidence against the existence of God, it remains the case that many people throughout history have come through their suffering to testify that their journey has somehow given them the strongest experiential evidence not only of God's existence, but of his deep personal love for them. I have a Kenyan friend who says that exactly that. She and her family lived through famine and hardship for her whole life, and yet when she came here to England, one of her first observations was to say, it must be so much harder for you to have faith in God when your lives are so comfortable. When do you ever really depend upon Jesus? And she has a point. Because when our lives are comfortable, we have little practical need to turn to God each day. We've become accustomed to comfort as if it's somehow our right to demand it. And so when we see or experience suffering or hardship, our immediate response is to focus on all of the negatives that are associated with it. But against that, while I don't want to glorify suffering at all, I do want to try to cast it in a biblical light and to show that there's so much more to it than the simplistic way in which we tend to approach it. And it's not just my Kenyan friends. The American anthropologist and psychologist Richard Schrader equally raises questions of the glib dismissal of the problem of evil that atheists so often hide behind. He says that while the framework of secular materialism might dominate within the elite institutions of Western society, the evidence is that it's largely ignored by actual sufferers. In 2012, after 28 people had been shot in a primary school in Connecticut, there was an article in the New York Times which had the title, "In a Crisis, Humanists Seem Absent." In the speeches by civic leaders and in the memorial services and funerals that followed, the author of the article commented on the heavy use of explicit religious vocabulary and symbolism used in almost every public ceremony by political leaders of all shades and by the sufferers themselves. Now, Connecticut's hardly the heart of the American Bible Belt, but every single family who lost a loved one in those shootings chose to have a religious ceremony. And a presidential eulogy by Barack Obama was essentially a sermon speaking of God calling the children home, quoting extensively from the Bible, using its hope for a world and a life beyond this one to console and make bearable the losses we experience now. In an ever increasingly secular society, it was striking how secular convictions just evaporated. And the article itself asked very pointedly, where were the humanists? His point, and the point I suppose that I'm stressing now, is that this secular atheism, if it holds on to its central convictions, it has to insist that concepts of good and evil have no ultimate meaning, that morality is simply a construct that serves the cultural sentiments and preferences that dominate at any given moment, and that suffering is just something that people have to get on with, a meaningless inconvenience to be overcome or otherwise terminated, euthanized, in whatever way society deems to be the most practical or efficient. In other words, if we try to remove God from the equation, we're still left with the problem of suffering, but we're just robbed of any constructive way of making sense of it. So whereas almost all other cultures down through history and around the world today have found that despite its painfulness, suffering can be an important means of actually achieving greater purpose in life, or of propelling you towards the most important goals. The dominant narrative of secular materialism in the West doesn't recognise any bigger purpose in life at all, and so seeks to avoid pain at all costs. In a book that I've been reading by the American pastor Tim Keller, he quotes the social theorist Max Scheler, who wrote, "An essential part of the teachings and directives of the great religions and philosophical thinkers the world over has been on the meaning of pain and suffering." And he went on to argue that every society has chosen some version of these teachings to give its members, he says, instructions to encounter suffering correctly, or to suffer properly, or to move suffering to another plane. And he says that sociologists and anthropologists have analysed and they've compared the various ways that cultures train their members for grief and pain and loss. And when this comparison's done, it's often noted that our contemporary secular Western culture is one of the weakest and worst in history at doing so. At a trivial level, it's the denial of anything beyond the immediate and physical that leads us to ban children from playing conkers, or from throwing snowballs, or from climbing trees in case someone gets hurt. Wrapping up and protecting of a whole generation in the vain hope that they'll be protected from anything unpleasant happening to them. But on a more serious level, it's the practical denial of any possibility that suffering might form any meaningful part of life, and the insistence that it's always an interruption. The perspective that led many of the doctors around my friends at the time that Millie's condition was diagnosed to urge them strongly to terminate the pregnancy. A decision that would certainly have minimised suffering in one sense, but at the cost to that family and to so many around them of being denied a remarkably precious gift. A gift for which they're so hugely grateful despite the pain that came with it. So what then does Christianity have to say that's different to any other worldview and that can help us face the reality of suffering? Well, it has a great deal to say, as it turns out. Because a Christian view of suffering doesn't shirk it and shrug like atheism does. It doesn't dismiss it as an illusion like Advaita Hinduism, or just strive to rise above it like Buddhism. Christianity recognizes the deep reality and pain of suffering, but within and through suffering it also discovers hope and the possibility of transformation. And because Christians believe that God relates to us where we are rather than through a series of abstract philosophies, it shouldn't surprise us to find that the Bible deals with suffering from many different angles. each of which might just help us in different ways in our different situations as we grapple with the reality of the broken, messed up world that we live in. Why? Why was the question that I raised earlier. Why suffering? Well, as a Christian, I still can't answer that. The first thing to recognize is that the whole question of suffering, just like the question of our existence, is bigger than any one of us can fully fathom. Like I said earlier, every culture in human history has tried to find explanations for suffering. But one of the most helpful things that the Bible testifies to is the fact that there are no simplistic answers. Our tendency in the West today is, as our assessment of our own capacity becomes ever more inflated, is increasingly to place us in the centre of our universe and then to try to explain everything with reference to ourselves right in the middle. And when it comes to suffering, though, that can often leave us feeling even worse. Because we need something or someone to blame, some concrete explanation to pin things onto. And so we blame ourselves, or we blame someone around us, or we look for some other scapegoat, like God. And when so often we can't find any satisfactory explanation, like I said earlier, to our suffering, we add anger and bitterness. But the Bible adds a constant corrective when we place ourselves above everything else, above God as the final arbiter. In Isaiah, God reminds us that God and his ways are actually beyond our ability to understand fully. And it can actually be a real release to be reminded of the fact that our capacity to understand really is limited. You see, just because we can't see a reason doesn't mean that there isn't a reason. In fact, it would be the height of self-deluded arrogance to suggest that because I can't perceive a reason, there therefore is no reason. And so, as we work to build our trust in God, we also find ourselves able to trust in his infinite perspective, in his infinite capacity to put things right, even when they look bleak to us while we're in the thick of it. And I'll come back to that in a minute or two. So, it can sometimes lift a huge cloud from us just to be reminded that we don't need to be able to explain everything, to have confidence that God might still have a plan for us that will make sense of our suffering. And it's not a cop-out. You see, it's actually okay to let God hold it and to hold us without having to intellectualize it. In fact, it was simply being able to rest in God as he knew him, and to trust in that God to hold the bigger picture that he couldn't expect to see this side of eternity, to help my friend when his wife and his son were so tragically killed in that car smash. Just trusting that God had it, even though he couldn't make sense of it. It was a relief for him. But a second thing that the Bible reminds us is that a great deal of suffering is actually directly caused by us, by humankind ourselves. C.S. Lewis once observed that it's our self-interest, our self-preservation and our appetites, our jealousy, our resentment of other people that's so often at the root of the worst kinds of suffering. He wrote, "It is man, not God, who has produced racks and whips and prisons and slavery, guns and bombs. It's by human avarice and human stupidity that we have poverty and overwork." Just reflect for a moment on why so many people are suffering in Ukraine right now. And yes, perhaps in another universe, God could have created beings who had no capacity to choose, but were obliged only ever to do what was right. But the other thing that the Bible tells us is that God didn't create human beings to be automata, to be biological robots who had no option but to run about doing his bidding. It tells us that he gave us the freedom and the ability to choose. Because the incredible thing that the Bible tells us about God is that he wants us to be in a genuine relationship with him. And the most valuable kind of relationship is one in which people have the choice as to whether or not to engage in it. I've got 4 children, and I have a wonderful, close relationship with all of them, which is such a blessing. But just picture the difference between these two scenarios. My youngest son, he comes into the room and he says, "I love you, Daddy," because he's got no other option. He's just programmed to do it without any genuine choice in the matter. Or picture the alternative, that he comes running in from school and he flings his arms around my neck and he gives me a big hug out of genuine personal choice to express his love in that way. Love isn't love if it's forced. But because God has chosen to give us the freedom to choose how we express ourselves, the unavoidable cost that comes with that choice is that suffering will follow when we choose to act without considering others in the same way that we consider ourselves. Suffering exists, at least in large part, because we use our freedom to choose badly. And so to use God as a scapegoat for all suffering not only fails completely to help us when it comes to terms with, help us to come to terms with what we all go through at times, but it's also just not being honest. But then that same recognition of how God wants us to live in close relationship with him also gives us another lens through which we can view suffering. Because the Bible explains to us how, far from being remote and callous and disinterested in us, God actually knows what it is to suffer himself. In John's Gospel, we see how Jesus himself experienced the full range of human emotions. Faced with the personal tragedy of a friend who died, Jesus was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. We're told he wept. In human form, God himself was moved with anger and outrage at the wrongness of suffering and death, which gives us in turn, it gives us the freedom and the permission to be angry and outraged at suffering in the world without being angry at God. In fact, half the book of Psalms in the Bible is in one form or another. It's people crying out in their pain, in their weakness, in their trials, and being totally real before a loving God who wants nothing more than for us to come to him with our pain so that we can begin to find comfort in him. And the reason that he's able to relate to us in our suffering and to provide that sort of comfort that we need most deeply is that the God of the Bible is himself a wounded God. Jesus' life on earth culminated in his suffering and death on the cross at the hands of others, which means that God not only experienced the full range of human emotions to be able to relate to us in them, but he's also himself faced suffering and death. Now, I agree, if it had stopped there, perhaps it would be hard to find either comfort or strength in that fact, or the hope of ultimate meaning and purpose in our suffering. If it had stopped there, I for one wouldn't be sitting here recording this telling you that Christianity offers anything more than any other speculative religious explanation. But of course the reason I am here today is that it didn't stop there. The Christian worldview doesn't arise out of pragmatism, wish projection or speculation. It arises out of the confidence of historical reality. You see, not only does God know what suffering is, but he took the epitome of human suffering, something which had the appearance of utter despair and pointlessness. He took that and he turned it into something utterly glorious that's given hope and strength to billions of people over the 2,000 years since. Because God took Jesus' death on the cross and by raising him to life again used it as the exemplar of how it's in his power and it's in his plan to take even the deepest depths of suffering and to transform them, it means that we can look at things differently too. There's a verse in Romans chapter 8 that tells us that in all things God works for the good of those that love him. And Jesus' resurrection is the concrete proof of the fact that those are no idle words. Those are no hollow words. When we find ourselves asking the question of why we or why anyone close to us is suffering, we may not find a clear answer. But many people have drawn huge comfort, huge strength from allowing themselves to reflect on why God also allowed his own son to suffer. There was a reason, you see. There was a reason. No one else could see it at the time, but God knew the reason. And God used the suffering to achieve something that could never have been achieved without it. So we may not find all the answers, but we can be strengthened by the assurance that the God of love will act in love to bring good out of suffering when nothing else possibly could. And that promise is made to everyone. One of the privileges of my current role as vicar is that people come to me when they are struggling. But something that I come across frequently when someone's going through the mill is that on top of whatever else is going on in their lives, they can beat themselves up too. See, when we're feeling at low ebb, we're hugely vulnerable to believing that somehow we deserve it. That even if there is a God, and even if he does have a plan, we're not part of it because we're just not good enough. But again, the Bible helps to lift us out of that downward spiral because it makes clear that when God stepped into a suffering and broken world to set things right, he didn't come to rescue those who got everything sorted already. Not that there is anyone in that category, but instead he came with a mission specifically to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom from the captives, and to release from darkness the prisoners. In other words, he came to bring comfort, and he came to bring healing, and he came to bring hope to anyone who comes to him ready to accept him. That's the only qualification, that we come willing to ask. And when we do that, he makes no promises that our problems will all disappear, but rather that he will be with us from that moment onwards, taking our suffering and using it in a new way, transforming it and transforming us through it. When we look to Jesus, he alone, among all other worldviews, offers strength and hope as we walk through suffering, as we learn to depend on him each step of the way. In fact, the very fact of suffering and the way in which Christianity finds meaning through it has led prominent Christians to say, I could never myself believe in God if it weren't for the cross. The fact that, as St. Paul writes to the Corinthian church, that God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself as he suffered, it actually lifts us from the temptation to close ourselves into a dark hole of self-pity, and it gives us a fresh perspective, enabling us to identify in our suffering with something much bigger, much more significant than we otherwise appreciate. When our oldest daughter Isabel was born with no sight in her right eye, we were devastated. She had all sorts of investigations, she had operations within the first weeks of her life, and our idyllic notions of parenthood were turned upside down for a time. But do you know, one of the things that gave us a proper perspective on what we were going through? It was sitting in the outpatient department at Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital and seeing what other parents and children were coping with. Identifying with other people in their suffering somehow gave us the strength to see things altogether more positively, to focus our gaze on the amazing blessings that we had rather than on the things that weren't perfect. But to know that God had voluntarily taken upon himself to give up everything, to suffer and die on the cross for us, to know that God is prepared to walk alongside us and to be able to identify with him in our darkest moments, that's just incredible. That put all suffering in a different light. And of course, as I wrap up, one final but pivotal thing that the Bible helps us with is that it tells us about the end of the story. And it confirms for us that this life isn't all that there is. Even when it seems that some or all of this life has been snatched away, has been corrupted or spoiled or destroyed. A Christian perspective of suffering gives us the assurance that God has an eternity in which to put things right. Speaking through the prophet Joel at a time when the people had been devastated by famine and pestilence, God makes the promise, I will repay you for the years the locusts have eaten. And the same promise holds for us, albeit under different circumstances. If God is sovereign over all of human history and has eternity at his disposal, then he's able to make good whatever afflictions strike whenever they strike. For reasons that we've already explored, he may have allowed evil and suffering to enter the frame for a limited time, as the price to be paid for our free will. But we can also know that suffering doesn't form any part of the end of the story. Revelation at the very end of the Bible describes in vivid picture language how God's creation is working itself out towards perfection. Revelation 21 verse 4 says, "There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has been put away." The big picture is that whatever we're living through now, we're being prepared for a prize beyond compare, something that will totally outweigh even the worst that the world can throw at us. It's the end of the story that the New Testament authors point towards to encourage and sustain their contemporaries. St. Paul, who wrote half of the New Testament, he said, "I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us." And he also writes, "Our light and momentary troubles," and remember he writes this as somebody who was beaten, he was flogged, he was imprisoned, he was chained, he suffered more than most of us could imagine within a lifetime. But he says, "Our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." However else we understand what's going on at any particular moment, we need to understand it with reference to that end of the story. We've not found an answer to the question of how God's working in our suffering. But however he does, the Bible makes clear that it's in that end to the story that we can find greater compensation for suffering than any one of us can imagine. Ultimately, though, the way that we respond to suffering is a choice that we all have to make for ourselves. Fighting it on our own, perhaps in anger or bitterness, trying to grit our teeth through it for as long as we're able, or throwing in the towel in despair, perhaps. Just living for the moment, maybe, trying to make the best of an ultimately pointless existence. Any of those ways, or alternatively, like countless Christians who've had to endure suffering through the centuries, we can take seriously what lies in store for all those who follow Jesus and find in that hope, in him, an extraordinary source of strength and comfort. And I, for one, would love to do whatever I'm able to help any of you towards that last option of finding hope in him, finding in him a source of strength and comfort. And if we manage to sort it out, I hope to be able to join you shortly live to field questions. But otherwise, I'm quite sure that Mark or one of the team there will be able to pick up those questions. But let me just thank you for listening. Thank you for your forbearance in understanding that I can't be with you this evening. But over to you.